我的草原，我的马是我想咋耍就咋耍，困的泪水滑脸颊，陈总数钱解解法。
What the hell is even that?
Alright, good afternoon YouTube. In today's video, I will be answering your questions that you submitted on the community post in the community tab. So before I get into that topic, I do want to make Q&As a regular part of the channel. So every month I will have a community post where you'll have the opportunity to ask your questions and get my thoughts on them. So let's get started. The first question comes from Fit You Jack. So something he wants my opinion on is whether or not a lifter should go through a dedicated strength block, even if their primary goal is hypertrophy. He cites that they should at least get the first wave of adaptations, and that would be worth engaging in, even if someone who exclusively cares about hypertrophy, simply because it's more efficient and it provides a more potent dose. He cites comparing 2 sets of 8 to 12 at 300 pounds by one lifter, and then 2 sets of 8 to 12 at 455 by another lifter. So I think this is a pretty interesting talking point, and it's a pretty interesting question to ask, because I do think it is one that a lot of people can kind of get almost tripped up in. First and foremost, I don't think a dedicated strength block is necessary for someone who cares exclusively about hypertrophy. Strength work is going to be a part of their bodybuilding process because you can't really separate size and strength on the individual level. Now, when it comes to your example of 2 sets of 8 to 12 at 300 pounds versus 2 sets of 8 to 12 at 455 pounds, there's a couple things we have to take into consideration. The first one being the difference between lifter 1 and lifter 2. Are they the exact same person? Are they people of the exact same build? Are they genetic clones of one another? Because the main issue here is that when it comes to strength and strength potential, there is a wide variability. But the main thing is, as long as either lifter gets stronger, so let's say, for example, lifter 1 who is currently squatting 300 pounds for 2 sets of 8 to 12, if they add 100 pounds to their squat, they got bigger. Similarly, if another lifter got up to 455 and adds another 500 or another 100 pounds and gets to a 555 pound squat, he will also have gotten bigger. The correlation is not necessarily the amount he's squatting and his muscle size. It's more so that he got stronger, now he's bigger. So that's kind of more the relationship there. And then also, let's say they are the same person, and that lifter 1 currently is squatting 300 pounds, and then later down the line in his training career, he squats 455 for multiple sets and multiple reps. The issue is here is that when it comes to his overall potential, it's probably still percentage-wise about the same. Let's say 300 pounds is around his 65-70% of his 1 rep max. And then later down the line, as he gets bigger and as he gets stronger, 455 now represents that 70%. Regardless of the methods he used to get there, meaning whether or not he used a dedicated strength phase, is almost irrelevant because the amount of weight he added will reflect itself in his physique. You can accomplish this whether you do this in, a very periodized approach, or if you decide to use something that's more auto-regulated based on more double progression models of training. It might take you a longer time to get there, but I would say at least the main driver of your increase in strength would be size in that case. So regardless of the methods you use to get there, if you add 100 pounds to any one of your lifts, you are going to get stronger with or without a dedicated strength block. If your main goal is hypertrophy, you don't really need that. And then when it comes to the first wave of adaptations and needing the coordination, that is something that you can adapt to at any given time whenever you decide that you want to. There are many examples of bodybuilders transitioning into powerlifting who, just by sheer virtue of them being bigger and having built up a large body of work capacity, that when they do become more coordinated with the lifts, that they excel incredibly well. And they didn't do many dedicated strength blocks in their training, at least not to my knowledge. So while I think this is an incredibly useful and interesting talking point, dedicated strength blocks are not that necessary. Part of the reason why I advocate a more power building lean on my channel and why I apply it to my own training is because I don't think super or hyper specialized training is totally necessary unless you have more of a competitive lean. I think just general adaptations, general strength, general size, and training in a way that suits your psychology is going to be much more important. So while I think this is interesting and it's definitely worth mentioning, I do not agree with the conclusions brought up here. I think that it doesn't really matter so long as progression is a theme of your training, and progression in multiple ways, not just weight on the bar. So increasing reps, increasing sets, maybe decreasing rest times, having more control of the weight also. These are all, there's so many different ways to progress in your training, and regardless of how long it takes you to add that 100 pounds, so long as you're moving in that direction, you are getting bigger, strength blocks or not. The next question comes from Sonic Wave. If your goal is long-term muscle and strength gain, but you don't care about leanness, at least in the short term, would it be more productive to generally stay at a higher body fat percentage? E.g., instead of a traditional bulk to 20% followed by cutting to 12%, get to approximately 17% and bulk more conservatively from there. If you get too high, do a small cut or even recomp phase back down to 17, such that you don't fluctuate as much in the end. So there's going to be a couple things that go into my answer here. First and foremost, 17, that is a very reasonable amount of body fat. It's a lot leaner than you think, but I don't really think it's as lean as you should be to start a very sustainable or long-term bulk. The problem with starting at 17% body fat is that you are not going to be able to spend a significant amount of time in your bulk phase. You will reach a fluffier state faster simply because your starting point is much higher than it should be otherwise. I think in a very recent Bald Omni-Man video, he cites 13% as a better starting point, and I definitely agree with that. It gives you a significantly longer amount of time spent bulking. Anytime you're not spent bulking, you're getting less optimal results. Bulking is a highly productive phase of training, and the more you have to do cuts or recomps, the less time you're spending in that more anabolic state. So I would definitely recommend that even if you don't care about leanness in the short term, it's kind of a misguided sacrifice when you sacrifice long term versus short term. Even if in the short term it doesn't seem to matter, seconds make minutes, minutes makes hours, hours make days, days makes weeks, so on and so forth. You have to have both the appreciation and view of long-term and short-term and kind of see whether or not you're sacrificing one for the other sometimes. So I don't think 17 is the best starting point, but there is something I want to say on this point also. Every single person kind of has a different, I think it's called like a set point, like a body fat set point. Now, I'm not necessarily stating this as a scientific fact. It's just kind of an idea that I'm partially aware of. But the point that I want to make here is some people lean more toward naturally being smaller or leaner, and others are more geared towards being a bit bigger, you know, being a bit higher body fat percentage. So when it comes to long-term consistency, it's probably better to choose what's best for you. If cutting down to 12% is incredibly difficult and even less productive, then yes, starting maybe at 15%, bulking to 20, and then recomping or going back down, losing 10 pounds and going so on and so forth, that can be equally as productive. It kind of just depends on you and what you are able to stick with. But there's a lot of different options, but I don't think that just gigabulking out to oblivion is a good idea. A good proper bulk is literally just a slight increase in your portion sizes. It's not adding in a whole other meal. It's not changing up your diet to allow incredibly fattier or calorie dense foods into your diet. It's just like an extra cup of rice, maybe an extra serving of proteins, and what else have you. That's really all it should be if you're going to be doing it the right way. And if you start at a lighter body fat percentage, then you can do that for much longer. So that's my recommendation there. The next question comes from GE. Well, this is more of a hot take. So right now he's kind of in a F-optimal or F-optimum mode. He just lifts the way he wants to with discipline weaved in and around some form of progression, and he does it with consistency. One block might be 8 to 12. The next block may be time-based circuits, as many reps as you can do in 60 seconds without aiming to fail, or 5 exercise superset across 4 to 5 different rotations. Very interesting style of training. Not necessarily sure it's what I would do myself or recommend, but if it's getting you towards your own goals, then that's really what matters the most. I do think that our goals would probably differ, and it might differ from most people on this channel as well. But his hot take here is that failure training may not be the best muscle builder, but it builds the best kind of people. His claims here is that it reprograms the way you think on the micro scale. It turns you into someone unafraid of trying because they may fail. And over time, that way of training starts to penetrate all aspects of your life, and you begin to give everything more effort.
I'm built different.
So this is kind of like a morality, ethical kind of question. And couple of challenges I would present here is, well, what about moderation and patience? Moderation and patience are, by its very nature, not something that requires you to train to failure, as that would be entirely contrary to that. So, and many great people that we admire embody that to an extent. So when it comes to not being afraid of failure, you can do that without having to push it to the nth degree all the time. So I think in that case, the reasoning kind of falls short there. Another thing too is that when it comes to failure training is that there's a lot of different ways that you could do that. There are also examples of when the cost of failure is incredibly high. For example, overthinking can definitely stop you from taking action, but sometimes that's not really a bad thing. Something that I really like, or an idea that I really like, is that thinking allows you to kill your ideas without killing yourself. So kind of take a evolutionary idea to this. For example, you see something like lava for the first time. You really have no idea what lava is, but you know, like going back to caveman monkey days, and you just see it and it's like, what the hell is this thing? I'm getting really warm going toward it. Let me throw something in it and it burns. All right, cool. It burned up. I'm not going to touch it. I didn't have to shove my hand in it and not be afraid of failure even if because I don't know and I'm just going to try to figure out what it is. Because I was able to think things through and not go to that degree, I'm able to then survive. So I think that failure training is most definitely a skill and can be applied, and there's definitely a benefit to it. For example, Jeffrey Verdi Schofield is one of the best examples of someone who can just grind out more reps and more volume, and that is going to be highly beneficial. But at the same time, there's examples where it's not as beneficial. So when it comes to there being one method that builds the best people, I think if it were just as simple as going to failure, while failure is incredibly necessary to personal development, it's not the only thing. And for most things in life, one answer is not the right answer. The next question comes from Tom Lazarick. So I recently found Tom's channel from GVS, and him wanting to have other people reply to his video talking about what he wished he knew when he first started lifting. And Tom is an incredibly knowledgeable guy, great physique, and seems to be an incredibly nice guy. Hopefully sometime in the future when I have more time, I can get him on the channel and have a discussion with him as well. And he asks, what is my most controversial lifting / fitness opinion? In other words, something you believe in, ideally strongly, that many others may disagree / take issue with. He congrats me on my success, and also wants to know my favorite movies. So thank you so much for your support, man. Really hope that you reach levels of success that I can't even imagine. I definitely think that you're on that path, so keep working at it, brother. I really do think that you're doing some great work out there. So, and crazy physique too. Like that's a sign of like incredible hard work and discipline there also. Now, when it comes to my most controversial lifting opinions, a couple that I have, I'm not necessarily sure how controversial they are, but for one, barbell rows, Pendlay rows are still top tier, S tier exercises. I don't really think that the pull to exclusively chest supported rowing variations is that useful. I do understand the reasoning behind it and I do agree with it. However, I also still hold that the body is very resilient and can most definitely adapt to using barbell rows and pen lay rows, especially where they are using a bit more body English, and that the stimulus to fatigue ratio, while it might not be perfect, the simple fact that you're getting a significant amount of stimulus is still going to be incredibly worthwhile. It's still something that I include in my training right now, where I'm using the pen lay row as somewhat of a deadlift variation on a separate day. And I still supplement a lot of other different rowing variations in my training, because I just think rowing is going to be one of the best ways you can spend your time in the gym personally. Other options, power building is amazing. I think that hyper specialized training isn't really needed, and I think when it comes to just long-term base building, power building is an exceptionally good way of going about that. I'm not saying it's the best. I'm not saying it's a panacea or like the secret or anything of that nature. It's just what I found works well for me, and if it's something that works well for your psychology and allows you to keep a fire in your heart for your training, I think that's what matters more than anything else. There are different styles of training that are out there, but they apply significant amounts of heart, focus, intention, and all of those things are carrying their training into their physiques, where they have these impressive physiques, and that's really what matters most. Power building is just my expression of that, and I think that is totally fine. Now, when it comes to movies, I am a weeb, I am a nerd, I like samurais, and I like dudes with katanas, all right? So one of my favorite movies of all time, The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise. Hiroyuki Sanada is a GOAT. Ken Watanabe is amazing. Tom Cruise, when he's on screen, cool guy. Don't really know how I feel about him when it, like, outside of movies, mainly because of all his like crazy stuff and whatever, but you know, beyond that, his movies are great. The Mummy, that was one of my favorite movies growing up. Love Jackie Chan movies, love Arnold movies. Sylvester Stallone movies are some of the best ever. The Rocky movies have such a special place in my heart, simply because that's what actually got me into working out and training as crazy as I did when I first started working out. The most recent Batman movie, and of course the Christopher Nolan Batman movies as well, these are movies that I can definitely just keep rewatching on a pretty regular basis without ever getting bored. Creed movies go up there as well. There's the Infinity Saga of the MCU, and then everything after that I just kind of think is a fan fiction. But there's a lot of great movies out there. Adam Sandler movies are wonderful. 50 First Dates, Happy Gilmore, Mr. Deeds, Click. There's just so many good ones. The Water Boy, like, huge football fan, and like, that movie is just like one of the best ever. So a lot of good movies out there. I could just go on and on and on, and I would love to talk about these with you maybe one day in the future, but those are some of the first ones that come to mind. There's another hot take that's included here with his question, and that is, there's no such thing as junk volume. Every set, every rep counts towards something. Nothing done in training is worthless junk, because everything is better than sitting in front of a screen. And I definitely see where he's coming from it as well, but I'm not necessarily sure that I agree, because we have to be kind of clear with what we mean by junk volume. Sometimes I do see junk volume meaning volume that you get no benefit from, and if that is the definition that one person is operating from, I definitely agree with what you're saying here. Yes, every set and every rep does count towards something. Something is better than nothing. But then there's also the other side to that, where junk volume might be more so described as it's volume that's not necessarily efficient, or volume that might actually be a bit more detrimental. And in that case, I can definitely see that being a thing, and so in that case, junk volume is instantiated. So it really just depends on what we mean by it. And I do think most people actually take the latter definition as their meaning for junk volume. So when it comes to every set and every rep counting towards something, 100% agree. Training works. The best way to build muscle is to go in the gym and work out. Now, the actual methods and things that we apply might differ, but the fact that you went in there is definitely the best way of going about things, rather than sticking these weird machines to your body thinking that that's what's going to get you big.
Hey, when we go to the gym, we know you use weights for resistance. When you're on the whole body vibration, when you're on the whole body vibration machine, the vibrations are acting as your resistance.
This is #1 bullshit.
In that case, yes, no such thing as junk volume. But is there such a thing as a point of diminishing returns? And if you exceed beyond that point, will it actually force you to regress? Yes, that's a thing too. And then also, is there a way to train in such a way that your time and effort will be better placed somewhere else? I would definitely say so. You can inflate your training tonnage by doing absurdly high reps and sets, but then be using such low weights. So I do think that there is such a thing as junk volume in that case. Help asks, what are the struggles you face as a creator in the fitness side of things? Considering there's no shortage of fitness tubers, and now the rise of natties, everything that could possibly be covered has been 100 times over. So how do you go about trying to separate yourself from the crowd and or making well-covered topics fresh? So the first point that I want to make here is that I kind of just don't think about that kind of stuff. One thing that I remind myself is that even if the underlying message is something that has been communicated many times in the past, maybe there's something in the way that I present it, it's the way that I word it, where it just makes it easier to click for someone else. There are a lot of times where certain ideas, topics, or pieces of information just never really made sense until I heard it phrased a different way, and sometimes that's incredibly necessary. Other things that I think about is that there's no one who's above the basics. There's no one who is above a foundational amount of information. So there's no reason not to continually add to a discussion that might have already been started and maybe even set 20, 30, 40 years ago. To me, I don't really think that's an issue, because when it comes to the overall consensus of the best ways to train for natural lifters, I think the fact that there is an overwhelming consensus allows us to better see people who are just trying to be contrarians, when it allows us to see people with bad information or just uneducated opinions, or it allows us to see when people are just trying to be a charlatan, because it just spits in the face of so much of what has been useful and effective for so many years. And while I do think that that also has the danger of being dogmatic, that's why I think there other channels coming up is not a bad thing either, where we can mediate between what is traditional and effective and also find ways to be progressive and also find other things that work just as well. We don't need to completely undermine and remove past knowledge, but we can always supplement it with all the things that we learn. So for example, biomechanics and training optimally. Done right, I don't think it conflicts at all with old school time-tested methods. If anything, it should enhance it. The issue is some people will take that term and take that marketing and say to get rid of everything that came before it, and that this should be the new way of training. Now buy my shit. That's where I think the problem comes in. So with more and more people advocating a very similar message of progressive overload being 100% necessary, but progressive overload is not just weight on the bar, so useful. A lot of people advocating the use of barbells, dumbbells, machines, cables, and a whole different styles of training. I also think that's incredibly useful. So standing apart, separating yourself from the crowd, I don't really think is always necessary. I know people glorify, you know, that whole lone wolf and, you know, whatever Sigma grind set kind of person. I don't really think it's always that necessary. The way I think about it, some people really just don't want to be a sheep or part of a crowd. But here's the thing, even though you need to travel your own path, that path doesn't need to be something new. It doesn't need to be something innovative. It can have unique aspects to it. You don't have to go reinventing the wheel just to be new for the sake of it. You can tread a very similar path, but find your own truths along the way that you take as part of your own identity. Akil MS asks, would training tibialis anterior or muscles used for plantar flexion help in squatting more deeply? It could. So for those who don't know, let's say this is your foot, right? This is your foot. This is just like totally flat. So, you know, so your tibialis is like, you know, going up this way. This, like when you're bringing your toes toward your shin bone, that's dorsiflexion. When you're trying to extend your foot down and point your toes toward the floor, that's plantar flexion. So when it comes to squatting more deeply, could that be a potential area that could help you with that? Most definitely. Is it going to be the only one, or do you need to do certain exercises? I'm not necessarily sure that's the case. I do think that maybe some mobility work could be useful. Maybe exercise regressions, even simply doing goblet squats, even something as simple as using an elevating your heel, using squat shoes. Sometimes that can be useful as well, because maybe depending on how your body's built, your squat depth will just be different and look different from someone else. Or maybe your ankles, due to whatever reason, just aren't as mobile. And while I do think it would be worth addressing, there's a lot of different ways to do that, and training your tib anterior muscles could be a way to do that, but I'm not sure that it's the only way. So could it be useful? I don't see why not. I think if you look at the knees over toes guy or people more experienced in that field, I think that you'll find a better answer there. And also, because there's so many people who are finding some success with the knees over toes guys methods, I think it's worthwhile to kind of count that as a potential of growth for yourself if you're finding that squat depth is not really going that well for you. Now, when it came to myself and squatting more deeply, all I did was squat more deeply. I did it with no weight on my back. I did it with goblet squats. I did it while being supported, like while holding onto the side of a rack and just forcing myself into a deeper position. That's really all I did for it. I didn't really do these tib anterior exercises when I needed to work on my squat depth, but I don't see why they wouldn't be a benefit. So go see their content, go see, so go watch his content, knees over toes guy, or talk to people who have more experience with those types of training. The next question comes from Iron Punk. What do you think about programming the same exercise multiple times a week, like overuse injury wise? Reason being, he's tried a lot of different bicep isolation exercises, but in the end, the most fun, accessible, effective has been the close grip easy bar curl. So I do them twice a week now with different rep ranges. Now I'm wondering if I should spend time to find a second curl variation or just keep it until I get hurt. So when it comes to overuse injuries and frequency of an exercise, I'm not entirely sure that the exercise itself is what's causing overuse injuries. In my opinion, it's more so the load management and the proximity to failure. So if you are training extremely hard and heavy with the same or similar exercises, that's where I think the issue comes from. So changing up your rep ranges, which I do expect to be done with a change in the weight you're using, is likely to be a good enough change to help with the longevity of you sticking with this exercise. Another thing I want to kind of bring up is how certain lifts usually don't leave certain people's exercises. So for example, lateral raises. I can definitely foresee examples of people who might change pretty drastic parts of their training program, but for whatever reason, lateral raises will stay a staple in their shoulder training. And I don't really think that they develop overuse injuries because they don't try to progress and load more than they need to. They might switch it out for something similar, for example, making the change from cables to dumbbells. But at the end of the day, you're using the exact same function, you're loading it. So I don't really think that that is enough, essentially. Or I don't think, but I do, okay. And you're still loading it. Now the strength curve might be different and that might be enough to override the biological law of accommodation, but I am leaning more towards that for the most part. They're still incredibly similar. So even though you're using a very similar movement pattern and whatnot, I still think that it's incredibly similar and you still don't develop an overuse injury. I think most overuse injuries do come mainly from poor load management. And there was something that Suboptimal Gains brought up that I do think is incredibly interesting. And he asks, what can we consider a variation? For example, NH says do X lift one day and X with a pause on another day. And yes, it is technically a variation, but would that prevent overuse injury? How different does a variation need to be to avoid overuse injuries? Is a pause enough? Is leg drive also valid? For example, the bench press and the Larsen press, or overhead press standing and the seated overhead press. Same tempo, same grip, just one is done without leg drive. And I do think that there's a couple things worth noting when it comes to this example. First and foremost, the most common changes you'll see where you have one lift and then on the other lift you do a pause is going to be between a squat and a pause squat. When it comes to a pause squat, you're getting rid of the stretch reflex and you can no longer bounce. You have to have constant control of the weight and then you have to reverse the movement and go up. By removing the stretch reflex and adding that pause, you're making it a self-limiting variation, meaning that by its very nature, by the lift's very nature, it is lighter. And that is why I think it doesn't result in overuse injury. Also, simply by adding that pause and having more control of the movement, you're having less shearing force on the joints, which could also help in preventing the overuse. When it comes to the other side of this, what about exercises where you can actually use more weight? And that's where I actually think that it becomes a little different. So in my opinion, we kind of have some understanding of the base form of an exercise. And then we have an understanding of exercises that are self-limiting, meaning that they're exercises where we can get more out of less weight. Then on the other side of that, there are also exercises where we can get less from more weight. And that can be a good thing and a bad thing. If we're trying to exclusively focus on one quality, the lockout of our bench press, the top end range of motion of a deadlift, the sticking point of a squat, then sure, there is reason to do things like rack pulls, board presses, pin squats, and things of that nature. But those movements are usually movements where you increase the load. Now, when it comes to things like rack pulls and block pulls, could you definitely do them for more volume? Definitely. If you are a long-limbed lifter and getting your deadlift volume from the floor is not a viable choice for you, then doing volume with rack pulls and block pulls could be a benefit. But if you are a bit more on the average side of things, those movements are usually going to be movements where you add more load to, and then you stress the structures even more. And that's why I think overuse injury is kind of more present there. If you have deadlifts in your program, but then you also have super heavy rack pulls, I think that's an issue. If you are doing heavy benching multiple times throughout the week, even if you change things like grip, I'm not necessarily sure that that's going to prevent overuse because you're training it at really high intensities every single time. So for me, in my opinion, changes in grip, changes in tempo, changes in stance, those substantiate, or those are examples of a variation. But how heavy we load them is really what causes the overuse. You can definitely go on a high frequency bench training program, but the fact that you're on a high frequency benching program doesn't automatically equate to overuse injuries, even though you're doing a certain movement pattern multiple times. Part of that is because one of those days is going to be almost exclusively recovery focused. You're not trying to push progression or be close to failure on that training day. And because of that, that allows you to train with that higher frequency. But I don't think there's any example of you just go all out. The only one that I can think of is the squat every day, where you just build up to a max. And you have to remember that it's a daily max. It's a daily top set. So you're going to find that your body fluctuates up and down a lot. And basically, because you're always training to your limits of what you can do that day, while you might not develop an overuse injury, you're definitely preventing your body from actually adapting and getting better. So when it comes to what do we consider variation, I do think changes in tempo, changes in grip, having a pause are substantial variations, but there's going to be a big difference between self-limiting variations and whether or not we treat them as such. So I hope that answered your question, and I hope you were able to make sense of my rambling there. But maybe this is an incredibly interesting topic, and I do think I'll make a full video discussing this in the future. It is something that has crossed my mind, and it is something that I'm going to be working on in another video, but I guess I'll flesh it out even more and give it its own video. Next question comes from John. Should I program chest flies if I'm mainly building strength? And then shin isolation exercises, question mark. Yes, even if your main priority is bench pressing strength, I do think you should program in chest flies. Reason being, let's go over some of the best benchers in the world. Julius Maddox, he does chest flies. Ed Cohen, when he was like at his peak in powerlifting, he did chest flies. Some of the best bodybuilders of all time, even though they're bodybuilders, they were still freaks of nature and like incredibly strong because that's just how they got big back then. They did chest flies. So I don't really think that there's any reason not to believe that they're going to be a detriment, and that we have more reason to believe that they're going to be a benefit. Another benefit that I can foresee from them is that they work because they work the chest in a manner that is substantially different from your pressing, it gives you another opportunity for growth. And the bigger your muscle is, the more strength it can generate, and then that translates over to your pressing. Another benefit of it is that because of the different range of motion and a deeper range of motion, meaning a deeper stretch, you might find that your pressing is more comfortable. So that is another added benefit to it. So I do think chest flies have a great benefit to being in your program, even if you're mainly building strength. The only reason I might consider chopping it is if you're in a peaking phase and you just would benefit from more recovery rather than from more volume. And then shin isolation exercises, kind of touched on this with the Tib Anterior question, but for the most part, if you do things like walking on a treadmill backwards, walking backwards with a sled, Tib Anterior raises, calf raises, that should be about enough. And you can just add these in on your lower days. You don't need to add a whole nother day or overcomplicate it more than it needs to be. The next question comes from Gabriel the Giga Chad. What is a good amount of big meals per day for bulking? So there's two ways to answer this question. The first way is the very oversimplified perspective, which is it doesn't really matter. The only thing that matters is calories, which is true. But then there's also the more practical part of it, which is if you're trying to optimize the most amount of muscle you can gain, more frequent protein feedings are going to be a benefit to you. The next part of it too is that if you're bulking and let's say you are more naturally lean, you're going to find it incredibly difficult to get the necessary calories in one meal. So having more meals spaced throughout the day is going to be an incredibly useful tool to make sure you're getting in enough calories throughout the day. To get the necessary amount of calories by the end of the day. Now, if you're someone more like myself who can actually eat thousands of calories in one sitting, then, you know, it's a little different. But if you are someone who struggles with that and your appetite just isn't as big, then more frequent feedings are going to be useful. So what is a good amount of meals? I would recommend 3 to 4. I think that's a great place to start. Next question comes from Ayale. How can you tell if you are in the right way to accomplish your goal? So first and foremost, make sure that you're measuring your goals in a reasonable metric. The biggest mistake that some people make, and I think it's a point that Basement Bodybuilding has done a great job at pointing out, is that a lot of people measure their hypertrophy goals by their strength increases. And that can be useful, but it can also have limits and issues arise from it as well. Yes, size and strength are incredibly correlated. But if your only measurement of am I getting bigger is are my lifts going up, there's other things you have to make sure that you're keeping an eye on that a lot of people just don't. Is your form the same? Did you widen your grip, increase your arch, and use more leg drive to help you keep making progress? Or did you keep your rep quality the same and then added the weight? That's incredibly different. So make sure you're measuring your progress in a way that's relevant to your goals. If your main goal is strength, yeah, sure. If your numbers are going up, that's really all that matters. If your main goal is size though, make sure you're taking measurements of your muscles, weighing yourself on a regular basis and whatnot. So that's really the best advice I can give you there. Next question comes from Shobo Nobo. I remember you commenting that you pulled your groin. How did you rehab that and other injuries you have had? So I pulled my groin sumo deadlifting. So after shitting on sumo deadlifting in a previous point, the reason why I pulled my groin is because if you think that sumo deadlifts are easier, I don't think you're wrong. But if you think that because they're easier, you can just never have done them, go into the gym, sumo deadlift 100 more pounds than your conventional, you're a dumbass.
Well, of course I know him. He's me.
So you still need to respect the exercise. You still need to respect the weights. So yes, while the sumo deadlift is a more advantageous lift, meaning it's an easier lift and you can more than likely lift more weight on it, you still need to build up to it. You still need to get used to the movement and still get used to movement pattern. You still need to let your body adapt to that exercise. And I didn't do that because I was that dumbass who thought that, oh, I bet my sumo is incredibly high. One of what I did, I just did the same exact number. I just lifted the same way that I do on conventional but then I pulled my groin because my body just was not used to that position. That's really what I did there. Now, when it comes to injuries and rehab, I am very lucky that I'm pretty robust and also pretty hard-headed, I guess. Oftentimes, my way to deal with injuries is nothing that special. I just go on as normal and lighten the weight a lot. and I mean a lot. So there was a time, so after I tore almost everything in my knee, like, and had like the worst knee injury of my life, I just went back into squatting with no weight. I just did body weight squats for quite a long time, and then slowly built up from there. Still building up now, to be honest with you, but now at least I can go full depth. I can lift weight, I can lift weights and whatnot. So it's, my squat is definitely my weakest lift, but at least now I am back to doing it high bar, low bar with weights, and still kind of heavy-ish weights and whatnot. But I didn't really focus too much on like physical therapy exercises, I guess you can say. Like, all I did was just do the movements that I'm trying to get better at extremely light, and then hypertrophy the relevant musculature and the muscles around it. So adductors and abductors, quads, hamstrings, whatnot. And that's really it. I didn't really do much else beyond that. Next question, and the last question, comes from Tank Top Man. How does someone go about growing their overhead press when they don't have the best build for it and can't do much volume for it? My other lifts have gone up, but this lift always stagnates the most. So the first thing that I would say here is that if you're struggling to grow your overhead press, I'm going to make a pretty blasphemous recommendation, and that is increase your bench. I think that most people will find that the overhead press may or may not impact their bench press, but I actually am inclined to believe that a lot of people can benefit from increasing their bench press and find that it does improve your overhead press more than the reverse. Pressing improves your pressing. Just think of it that way, right? So if you struggle with your overhead press, a couple things: close grip benching, incline benching, and dips. Just building up the relevant musculature that is going to be involved, that's part of it. Now, when it comes to volume, if the reason why you're not able to accumulate a lot of volume is because of your leverages, maybe adjust your range of motion for the exercise. For me, my overhead press, when I do an overhead press, I just bring the bar below my chin. I don't bring it down to my clavicle. For some, they might say that I'm therefore cheating the movement. I'm not doing full range of motion. And yeah, you're right, I'm not. But I don't really care. So this is where the movement starts and ends for me. I'm not going into a competition where I have to go from one place or the other. I find that trying to force it to my clavicle and go for those extra inches of range of motion is not really beneficial for me personally. I don't really feel like I get more out of the movement. If anything, I should feel that my shoulders are more uncomfortable in that position, so I don't do it. So that's part of it. The next thing too is, like, let's say for example you want to do something more like a pin press. So put pins at a point that maybe just like right around face level, you know, very vague guidelines and arbitrary guidelines here, but go to a point where you're going to actually be in a bit more of an advantageous spot where you can get a lot of volume and try to get more volume there. So use other exercises and then manipulate your range of motion. Then when you go into your testing, do a bit more lower reps, go to a more of a peaking style of training, and then take it from there. That's going to be my general recommendation for you if you're struggling to get enough volume with the overhead press. Another thing too is like dumbbells. If you find it difficult to get it with barbells, try other exercises. Machine pressing is incredibly useful. So there's a lot of different ways that you can go about it. So different exercises, different implements, cutting the range of motion, and then reintroducing that range of motion when you're trying to build back up to, let's say, a peak or a new PR. So that's going to be my recommendation there. And that is the end of the Q&A. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you found it useful. Hope you found it entertaining. And if there's any questions that you would like me to answer, you can leave them in the comment section in this video, or you can try to catch the next community post. So subscribe to the channel and keep an eye out for that. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.